Hello, welcome to the Blue Hour. I am Farah Guerrero. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My guest today is Dr. Werner Antweiler, an economist and associate professor at UBC's Sauder School of Business, where he holds the chair in international trade policy. He is also an associate editor of the journal Resource and Energy Economics and a faculty member of UBC's Clean Energy Research Center. Educated at the University of Cologne and the University of Toronto, his research spans international trade, environmental and energy economics, electricity markets, and applied econometrics. His published work has examined the relationship between trade and the environment, renewable energy, and electricity storage, international hydrogen trade, biofuels, vehicle emissions, and transportation policy. He's also the author of Elements of Environmental Management, an interdisciplinary book bringing together environmental economics, law, engineering, and business strategy. Today we're going to talk about his latest paper, Carbon Pricing, Capital Bias, and Electric Vehicle Adoption. It's forthcoming in the Canadian Journal of Economics, and it examines why consumers may reject a cleaner technology even when it would cost them less over its lifetime, and what that means for carbon pricing, electric vehicle subsidies, and the design of environmental policy. So Werner, thank you for coming to the Blue Hour today.
Good afternoon, Farah, and thank you so much for having me on your program today.
So you're no stranger to the media. I know this because I saw you recently on the CBC. Recently, sort of when things were a bit, difficult in our world, as they can be. And it was during this time of the crisis in the Middle East. And I thought, I'm going to get you back on my show because you were once upon a time on what used to be Prof Talk. And here you are, again, I don't know, many years forward, as both of our children have now grown up into young men. And we're going to talk about your research that you're looking at, things that you might have to explain a little more detail in ordinary language. But one thing is, I'll jump into it, is something that you call capital bias. And this is sort of around the limits of carbon pricing. So what is capital bias?
Yeah, that is consumer behavior. That is, when we go into a store and buy something, we are prone to look at the sticker price. And then we have our attention focused on this one number more than on what we call the life cycle ownership cost of something. So when we buy something and then we use it, then we incur a cost. When you own a car, you pay for maintenance, you pay for the fuel, and that's a lot of money. And that is, of course, on top of the purchase price of a car. And the same is true for many other things we buy. Anything that's a long-lived capital good, a car, an appliance, a home, that's something where we may focus too much on the purchase price and not enough on the long-term cost. And that can mean that if you buy something that looks cheap today, we're going to be paying more tomorrow. And that is what we call capital bias, the bias we have on focusing on the capital cost, not the usage cost. There's a more complex term for that. Economists like to call that internalities. And that is essentially anything that is where our focus is too much on the short-term cost and not enough on the long-term cost or benefit. So sometimes we ignore also the long-term benefits, and that's equally important. And so this is a psychological thing, and it's part of what makes economics different from our previous generation of economists, because we like to focus on consumer behavior and the psychology too. So behavioral economics is a new branch of economics that has really fundamentally changed how we think about behavior, how we think about our shopping and buying experiences. And that is exactly where my paper lands. My research is on that really crucial point. Now, why do people buy cars that are essentially in the long term more expensive than the alternative? And the answer is, well, they focus more on the sticker price.
Yeah, so you're looking at what is really it's not a life decision per se, because it's an asset that someone could buy and sell potentially. But the consumer is sitting at the dealership, and they have to make a decision. And you're looking at what that decision really is. It's that sticker price. So it's, as you say, the discount, even maybe with buying an EV vehicle, because there are incentives, which I want to talk about. But right in that moment, they're not maybe even able to think about the long-term decision, right? So like 10 years, let's put a number that comes up in some of your research. And why do you think that is? Is it anxiety? Is it not knowing? Is it lack of knowledge? What is really driving that uncertainty of making that decision?
It's actually a lot of different things that are coming together. Now, once you're in a car dealership and the dealer wants to sell your car, they want to make you walk out of the door with a sale. And so they will not talk about long-term costs. They will, of course, try to make a deal and focus on, now this car is cheaper than the other, so and focus on that. So they provide a lot of information that is about the here and now and not about the future. And there's also a lot of uncertainty about what these future costs can be, because the oil price, nobody knows what it's going to be in a year or in 10 years from now. And we have seen the gyrations of oil prices this year and in previous years too, when other things have happened. So this kind of wild swing makes it less predictable for consumers. And this uncertainty is also a mental challenge, because nobody likes to think about an uncertain future and an unpleasant future. Mm-hmm. And so people often look at today's prices as really the best predictor of future prices. And when you go and buy stocks and bonds and exchange-traded funds, I always say, previous returns are no good predictor of future returns, right? and so the same is true for all prices in the economy. They can swing, especially commodity prices, and oil prices are among the most volatile that we have. And in addition to that, electricity is also priced quite differently in different places. Here in British Columbia, we're in a spot where electricity is actually dirt cheap compared to most other jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. And gas is relatively expensive, especially in the Lower Mainland, because we have fuel taxes on top of the refining. Plus the refining and transportation here in BC is more expensive than it's in Alberta, for example. Mm-hmm. So we have some of the higher prices in Canada for gasoline and diesel fuel. That means there is a price wedge. Now, if you actually look at it, for every kilometer you drive, you pay about 4 times as much for a gasoline-powered car than for an electric car. Mm-hmm. 4 times. That's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So you can save a lot of money when you drive electric. Mm-hmm. So the more you drive, the more you save. Mm-hmm. And that means that people who drive the most would actually also save the most from adopting an electric vehicle. Okay, that's the one side. The more you drive, the more you save. The other side is the more you drive, the more you have range anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so there's another psychological factor that comes into play, especially in those places where the driving behavior is a lot of trips that are long distance. If you live in a rural area of Canada, and that's true for a lot of people outside the Lower Mainland and another place in Canada, they're worried about not only the charging infrastructure, but will your car deliver the mileage that you need to actually get from point A to point B and not run out of fuel. Because refueling, you can do pretty quickly at a gas station. If you charge up an electric car, it takes a lot longer. Mm-hmm. And so there is a discrepancy that we see in our empirical research between urban adoption of electrical vehicles and rural adoption of electrical vehicles. That's a huge gap. And overcoming that gap means in places like North America, it's going to take a lot more effort than in places like Europe, where distances are shorter and where the behavior is shorter. And the same is true also for China. Most people in China don't drive long distances. They live in urban clusters and they drive shorter distances. So we're seeing this dichotomy in EV adoption that is very much characterized by urban versus rural.
Now, you mentioned that, British Columbia we have good access to electric hydropower, in many, many respects. So, and this urban versus rural is very important, as you say. Canadians are notorious for driving long distances. It's normal to drive 12 hours to go fishing for the weekend and 12 hours to go back. And that certainly is different in other places, as you mentioned, Europe. Do you think that anxiety, part of this reason, sort of psychologically, why people feel hesitant to buy an EV vehicle is really that is running out of gas is one thing when you're off the grid, but not having electric power to even go anywhere can be a challenge. And I know this is beyond your research, but do you know how government is trying to settle this kind of conundrum?
Yeah, actually, there are two things that are really important to understand here, and that is consumer psychology is not driven just by looking at cost and those factors. There's a lot of ideology actually involved. There's a recent research paper that's coming from colleagues from the United States that looked at EV adoption across counties in the United States that are either very Democratic or very Republican. And it turned out there's not just controlling for like urban issues versus rural and controlling for income differences and a few other things. And turns out there is a big perception gap, and that is driven also by how EVs are being characterized in different parts of our population. And that gap is very significant, and it's in part driven by certain myths that are being perpetuated by some people who don't like EVs. And there's an active group of people who really badmouth EVs, and they claim all kinds of things that are factually not true. They even use environmental arguments saying, EVs, you're not really going to save CO2 emissions because there's so much more CO2 that's being emitted during the production of a car. It's true, there is more CO2 emitted during the production, but still not offsetting what you actually emit during the use. So the net balance is still positive. And in some jurisdictions like China, electricity doesn't come from clean sources, but it comes from coal to a very large extent. 2/3 of the power in China is generated from coal. But even there, you get savings, especially in urban areas, because you're not only reducing emissions of CO2, you're also reducing emissions of all kinds of other things that are coming out of the tailpipe out of a car, nitrous oxides, like basically urban pollution. So still environmental benefits in the end. And then you hear arguments that, EVs don't work in cold climates because Canada is like this unique place. And then, if you actually drive a gasoline-powered car, then I asked you the question, have you ever used a block heater? Because you're using, a car in a really cold area. Yes, and you have a plug-in in my car to actually plug in the block heater. And the same is true for EV batteries. They don't perform quite as well in cold climates. It takes a better insulation of the battery, sometimes even the heating. So there are EVs that you can adapt and for the northern climates that are really, really cold. But of course, that is not quite so true in urban areas where people park cars, often sheltered in the garages and parkades and whatnot. So that's a very different kind of experience. Here in BC, you pretty much don't need it in the lower mainland. In some places in BC where it gets really, really cold now, we can maybe talk about performance degradation a little bit. And of course, when you drive an EV, you're using the battery to heat the car, whereas in a gasoline or diesel-powered engine, there's excess heat coming from the engine that you recycle, otherwise just gets vented to the air. But overall, EVs are a lot more efficient because you're not wasting that heat in an EV. It's operating at much higher efficiency. So there are a lot of myths out there that in some cases are being perpetuated by interested parties that for ideological reasons, for political reasons, that don't like certain policies, the whole transition to EVs that's maybe hard on some of the manufacturers here in Canada. There are many reasons that come together that are this wild spectrum from psychology to politics to some economics. And that in the end means EV adoption here in Canada is a lot lower than in places in Europe. The leading country is Norway, where basically 9 out of 10 cars that are being sold now are electric or plug-in hybrid. To China, where more than every second vehicle is now electric because it's cheaper In China, it actually is. Here in Canada, not quite yet, but in places like China, EVs are cheaper, and people will buy what's cheaper and better, and that is an EV.
And then you have something quite interesting. It's when there are product differences that matter to the consumer but may not be visible to a researcher like yourself. So these could be even those little sort of, people drawn to the aesthetics of a car, the type of the brand, the sound of a motor, the performance, and that could also be a weighing factor in whether they decide to go electric or not. Although, as you saw with the hat I was wearing when I came into the studio, there are certainly even luxury brands now of cars that are really also producing electric vehicles. So there's no doubt they're even the cars that have been. I don't know if I know this for true, but I've even heard that they're even trying to mimic the sound of the motor in electric vehicles. So people, I don't know if they can get the vibrations, but certainly, they're wanting to still cater to someone who may have been a collector of a car, and then, and these are details that go way beyond, sometimes what you can actually pull out.
Oh yes. Also, we try to estimate some of the characteristics are observable. For example, how big a car is, how the weight and the size, the size of the engine, the dispersion of the engine. So there are a lot of characteristics that are metrics. Sometimes the trim of the car is something we observe that's being sold. So there's a lot of characteristics also implicit that are observable from the product itself. But then we don't know actually what appeals as a consumer. That is where my colleagues who study marketing actually get in on the game. And they have really wonderful, fancy psychological models too of what consumers react to. And as everybody knows who drives a car, it's not just about getting from place A to place B. Often it's actually showing off wealth, it's showing off status, it's showing off use, it's showing off all kinds of characteristics that are impressions of yourself and the color of the car, the style of the car. Now, why do we drive all different cars? Because we want to communicate something with the choice of the car. Like that we are sporty, that we are like old people like myself, want to drive safely. I don't know. And all kinds of stuff that we want to actually, the people who drive cars that are really, really loud, because we don't have restrictions on how loud a car is, and then they want to show off like something else altogether. So, I'm not religious about electric cars versus gasoline-powered cars. I love driving old-fashioned gas-powered cars, ideally with a manual transmission. But I also love driving my electric vehicle, which is super quiet, and it has a great torque and acceleration. It has all these other features that I like, and I'm completely open to. We're going to drive what's better for us in the long term. Hopefully, now we're going to recognize the environmental benefits of electric cars. We're also going to recognize eventually they're going to be cheaper in the overall life cycle cost. Already, that is true for many buyers. But for the sticker price, it's not necessarily reflected. And that's the reason why we end up with these problems of adoption, because people don't realize the full benefit at the point of purchase. And but ultimately, people buy what's cheaper and what's better. And that's what the market does. It will sort itself out eventually. And that's always what happens in the long term. When something is cheaper and it's better, and that is what people will go for eventually. Even there, of course, always a traditionalist who want to cling to what's past. And now there are always people who buy the fancy internal combustion engine cars like the Ferraris. And actually, that is an interesting story. Ferrari brought out a electric vehicle that kind of bombed with some of the traditionalists. It just didn't resonate. It was actually designed by somebody who worked for Apple, one of the chief engineers. And it just didn't resonate with the Ferrari buyers. It's just not a Ferrari if it doesn't roar. And so it clearly, we will have a part of the market that will always remain. But coming back to consumer characteristics, here in North America, people love to drive big cars.
Yes.
If you look around the cities, outside the cities in particular, I was just driving in Newfoundland, which is very rural in many places. People love to drive their pickup trucks. People love to drive their sport utility vehicles. And these are big cars, these big engines, and that is where the money is being made today. Ford and GM and Stellantis, they make their money not by producing sedans and compact cars. They make their money selling SUVs and pickup trucks. The best-selling vehicle in Canada is a Ford F-150. Ford did try an electric version of this, the F-150 Lightning. It failed. It sold to clientele, but essentially it couldn't grow the market beyond these early adopters, the people who would love to have their truck electric. But that is stagnating, and I mentioned there are political reasons too. It didn't sell to the group of people who are stuck in the world of the gas-powered car and for various other reasons. And so now there's going to be a new version of the F-150, I hear, so the grapevine. It has not been formally announced, but I think it's forthcoming. And that is a version of an F-150 with an extended range auxiliary power system. So it essentially runs on electric power as an engine, but then the battery that's in the car will be recharged continuously by a small auxiliary power unit that can be more efficient than a conventional gas engine. So essentially you get some of the benefits of lower emissions without the range anxiety. You get the torque that you need at times when you accelerate and you pull something, but that's going to be the new F-150, I hear. So Ford hasn't given up, but right now they're facing very strong headwinds, especially with the political climate in the United States. And I don't have to get into the details. Everybody who's listening will know what I'm talking about. But these headwinds won't persist forever. Let me predict that.
I have a funny story about the big cars because I live in a region, the Sea to Sky region, and we see a lot of what you might have seen in Newfoundland, a lot of big trucks, a lot of pickup trucks, and it's for all kinds of reasons. Mostly, I would say, to just store gear, so whether it's a snowmobile in the winter or mountain bikes on the back. And yesterday when I was driving, I saw 3 back-to-back pickup trucks with all their bikes on the back. So it's a lot of it is for utility, right? But I was in Italy, I think it was last year, and I saw one of these trucks from afar, and you never see them. I swear on this, big trucks. And the first thing I said to my son and his friend, who was also with us, I think that's a Canadian, and, it was a joke. But as we got closer to it, we saw an Ontario license plate. So, and then, I was right. So, I didn't expect that, especially in a very small town of Italy. But there you go, right? We do drive big cars, and that is a challenge. And I do want to talk about the Chinese EV vehicles. But before we get there, because that's something that is quite newsworthy right now, but I'd like to just bring it kind of into the sort of carbon prices, because we, as Canadians, we're hearing this a lot. We understand it to a certain point. We know that we've got a lot of taxes that we have to pay. But how does the carbon prices, without capital bias, the conventional economic result is that carbon price should equal the social cost of carbon, right? In some ways. So how, in your model, you explain some of these details. Can you bring that out?
Yeah. Let me summarize some of the key concepts here. One of the first things that my students learn when I teach them environmental economics is that when you have a negative externality, the thing to fix it is to put a price on it. And so the price in the case of carbon emission is what we call the social cost of carbon. And that is basically the present discounted value of all the future costs that arise from these emissions, the destruction it does to our environment, the heat, the heat waves, all the kinds of excess deaths that are now caused by climate change. So it's a real cost, and it's growing. And we typically put a number to it. The federal government of Canada puts it around $250 a ton. There are some research papers that put it even higher now. It may well rise as we're actually learning more about the ill effects of carbon emissions. But that is where the price should be. Now, there is a catch. When we put a price on carbon, and then we should see the necessary changes to adopt cleaner technologies. But enter consumer psychology. That is what gets in the way. So when you put a price on carbon, but people don't look at the future cost of the fuel that they're paying for, but only at the sticker price, and then not internalizing that. And we have a problem. That is the problem we faced with carbon pricing on motor fuels. Now, the government was putting a price on it, $80, and hopefully would be going up if it was continuing, until it did not. And it didn't quite work because for two reasons. One is this consumer behavior effect, and also the demand for fuel is very price inelastic. So we drive to work. We're not changing how much we drive. We change what car we drive, and that's only happening every so many times. Now, the average car lives for 10, 12 years. So it's a very slow turnover. And if you make the wrong decision when you buy a new car, by buying a car that's using too much fuel, and you could have saved money by buying an electric car, you're kind of stuck. You're not going to change your driving behavior because you still have to get to work every day. So carbon pricing isn't terribly effective when it comes to motor fuels for that reason, because the only variable that really changes the needle in terms of emissions is when you buy an electric car or plug-in hybrid. That is what we need to work on. And so the intervention that we needs to put this whole carbon cost up front, not when you buy fuel, but when you buy the car.
Exactly.
And that's what my paper essentially comes down on saying is, forget about not putting a price on the fuel because it's not really working. And the government was right to do this. And they probably did it for the wrong reason. So let me put that out there too. They did it because they were going to an election where the other party was running on the platform X as a tax, and they wanted to forestall that, and they did. So they probably canceled the carbon pricing for the wrong reason. But in the end, I actually agree with that measure because, actually, in the end, it wasn't so super effective. And what we need to do is we need to put this upfront on the point of purchase to make sure we're buying, quote unquote, the right car, the more fuel economic vehicle, the electric or plug-in hybrid. And we can do that by using other instruments, namely purchase subsidies. We still have to pay somehow for these subsidies. We can talk about how we finance these subsidies. And that's the same way of, when you take carbon pricing revenue and you recycle it, and the government did, the money that was coming in from carbon pricing was going back to consumers, actually in a very smart way, by going back to consumers based on a per capita basis. And it was a redistribution of income towards lower-income households. So it was actually very beneficial on a net basis for lower-income households. So it was actually, in a way, a very smart redistribution policy that I actually favored. And I kind of looked at it, always said, this is not a bad policy because it's redistributing money from the high-income households who are driving a lot and driving too big vehicles to those that are actually driving us more fuel-economic vehicles, or using public transit for that matter. But now, when we're looking at really wanting to change emissions, we need to look at intervening at the point of purchase, and that means providing purchase incentives, and that is where the government has now a new program that's replacing the old program, that is the Electric Vehicle Availability Program, or EVAP. That is brand new, and that's replacing an older vehicle subsidy, and also a provincial program that is being phased out. Many provinces like Quebec and BC had very generous provincial programs on top. And in addition to that, there's also, that is very important, a program that focuses on the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And that is the other big issue that we need to deal with. It's the old classic chicken and the egg problem. What needs to come first, the EVs and then the charging infrastructure, or the charging infrastructure and then the EVs? We need to kind of work on both fronts at the same time. And I have other research that I haven't published yet that actually looks at what I call the urban frontier of EV charging, because EV charging is still a big challenge in urban areas. Look at Vancouver, and we have a lot of people living in rental homes where there's a landlord who decides what's getting installed in their parkades, and we'll have a lot of people who live in strata buildings or condos. And we have a lot of people who can only park their cars on the street, and this curbside parking also impedes charging because, hey, you don't have a reserved parking spot. You're lucky if you get a parking spot in front of your home, and it's a luck of the draw if you can get a parking space there or not. So we need to work solutions that cover this. And also, and actually I have another paper yet I'm working on with UBC parking on workplace EV charging. And we're trying to figure out what is the right way to entice people to park in the other place where they leave a vehicle for a long time, the 8 hours or so they are at work in a place like UBC or a hospital or wherever they work. What can we do to make charging convenient? And it comes back to what I call the 3 C's of EV adoption: cost, choice, and convenience. It comes down to making these vehicles affordable, it means having enough choice, addressing all the consumer issues about now pickup trucks and other preferences, and let these cars roar if you want them. Some sound, like make them sound unique, or whatever other features you care about. And then convenience, because the one thing I've learned about charging is if you can charge your car at home, it's basically the plug-in and forget. That's the holy grail of EV charging. I come home with my EV, which is a plug-in hybrid actually. I come home, I plug it in, the next morning it's charged, and I can forget about it. I'd never have to drive to a gas station again. I don't have to drive to a public charger. The charging at home, that's a gold standard for EV charging.
And now, the first one, the cost, we'll just go back one quickly again, because the subsidies that you mentioned could look in different ways. And one of them was interesting to me because I'd never thought about it, a sort of usage-based subsidy that is something that is, to think about, because you have a flat subsidy that could be offered, and as the government incentives are, they get right away a deal, so to speak, from the and which is definitely I for sure there's an appeal. But then there's this kind of idea that as people drive their EV vehicle over time, they can, maybe when they renew their license, their insurance broker can tell them, okay, well, you've used this much mileage, and maybe they get a discount. I don't know how that would look like. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the questions is, can we do better than the simple subsidies we have been using in the past? And the simple subsidy looks like a flat subsidy where everybody who buys an EV gets the same amount. And that kind of looks from the outside as if it's fair, like, no differentiation here based on, say, consumer types or where you live or whatnot. But from an environmental point of view, we care about the emission savings. We want to actually get for every dollar we spend on subsidy, we want to get the most emission reduction we can get. So we want to actually subsidize the people who drive the most in terms of the EV adoption so that they switch and save the fuel and therefore the emissions. And so to the extent that we would be able to perfectly observe how much you drive in advance before you buy a vehicle, then we should differentiate it. And so we could, if there was a perfect knowledge of how much you drive, now we give you a higher subsidy if you drive more and a lesser subsidy if you drive less. For when you renew a vehicle, ICBC actually has introduced now a usage-based element in the recent years. So you report your mileage when you renew, so we know this. I have actually used some of their data in my research, and also I know what the mileage or kilometrage distribution is for the vehicles in BC. And so we could potentially use this kind of information to tweak our intervention. If you knew this perfectly, it would work. Unfortunately, there's another sort of conundrum, and that is if consumers are what are called myopic, they face this capital bias. Yeah. And so we need to know how those correlate. Now, if your usage is sort of perfectly correlated with myopia, and you're more myopic when you drive more, it kind of washes itself out, and the targeting doesn't work because these types are the hardest to convince to actually change. And so it's kind of then the usage-based instrument becomes weaker and weaker if the most myopic people are also the ones with the highest driving. It could well be the case now if that's correlates with like urban versus rural. So we don't know, and that's one of those research questions that are kind of really pesky. If you don't really know, you can't really target as effectively as you would like to. There are some arguments to think that, in fact, it's actually negatively correlated. And that is that the people who drive more are the ones that are less myopic, that are less capital biased. And that has something to do with different places in urban areas. Here in British Columbia, especially in the Lower Mainland, you have a lot of people who commute to work long distances because you can't afford to live in the downtown cores because they're too expensive. It's something we call in real estate economics, that is, you drive until you qualify for the mortgage, and that means so people they trade off lower housing costs for longer commutes and therefore longer driving. And so the people who benefit the most from more affordable EVs are those actually that live in the suburbs, and they commute to work and the distance that they can still charge at home, and they commute. So in this case, actually, there's this. These are also the types that are maybe paying more attention to the cost, the overall life cycle cost. So there's some evidence that would point to a negative correlation, but we don't have enough data. I can't pin it down. I estimate some of this in my research paper. I see the potential here for policy to work with this better information. But we'll have to see. At the very least, we need an incentive program that focuses on the point of purchase. The flat program is at least a good starting point. I have more research I'm doing right now on one program that the government actually has implemented too, which is to actually cap the incentives at a certain price point. So one revealed fact about purchases is that the people who buy luxury cars and the people who buy smaller cars, and the subsidies are being capped at a certain level. Here in Canada, it's now $50,000 at the federal level, and so if you buy like a car that's like $80,000, you don't get a subsidy. So you only get a subsidy if you're buying a vehicle that is cheaper, and that's often the case for people who commute to work long distance. They're fiscally constrained. They live in the suburbs, but they have to drive to work longer distances, and they drive more affordable cars. So in that sense, the question then is now, what's the right cutoff for this program? Now, which kind of vehicles should we subsidize? And maybe not the Teslas and the Polestars, but maybe the Nissan Leafs and the Kia EV4s and the more affordable EVs. And that is the kind of research I'm doing too, trying to figure out what is the smart way to intervene in the market at the least cost to the taxpayer and the least amount that we need to find from other sources. Because if you use subsidies, you need to find the money. It's not coming from, it's not falling from the sky. You have to divert it, or you have to raise taxes. Yeah. And, who's keen on raising taxes? I know the opposition in the parliament is not. And nobody is. Now, if you ask anyone, you want to pay more taxes? Now, I'm not volunteering, yes, so we have to find the money, and we have all kinds of other priorities for healthcare, now defense now, and we have all kinds of other things we need to do in this country, building infrastructure. And where do we take the money for EVs? Maybe one way to think about it too is to take it from the other buyers of cars. That is sort of redistribution of putting essentially a small penalty on buying a conventional car and subsidizing EVs. There is a good case to be made for this kind of redistribution. It's called a fee-bait sometimes. Sometimes it's called a bonus-malus scheme in Europe. And right now we're at a point where only about 1 out of 10 vehicles in Canada on average is of an EV. So we could put a very small penalty on the gas-powered cars and then redirect that money to those who buy an EV and sort of subsidize the emission reductions essentially to that channel. And we can do it in smart ways and to be most effective. And that's the kind of policy improvements that I'm investigating as part of my research as well.
And there was an interesting angle, which is home, in our province here in British Columbia, that your data showed a striking difference in the annual mileage, and it was pretty positive for EV vehicles, right?
That is precisely what my theory actually tells me, that EV adoption should be biased towards people who drive longer distances. And that's a very interesting new research result, because if you go back only 8-9 years, there were studies coming out of the US, California, where that wasn't the case. The typical EV was driving much less than the conventional vehicle. And we were also scratching our heads, and why is that? And the answer was in part range anxiety, and that was sort of the favorite explanation. But then also in the US, people have often more than one car. Yes. Households have 2 cars. Yes. And so they were using the EV as the runabout for the smaller distances, and then for long distance, they would use the other car. That is not the case in Canada. The households often don't have 2 cars, to a much, much lesser extent than the United States. So it's your primary vehicle, and if you drive your primary vehicle, then the EV adoption is biased towards driving longer distance because that's where it's cheaper. That's precisely what theory would tell us, and we see that in the data. So it's a very convincing argument that in Canada, the world works like economics tells us it would, and now we don't have the sort of odd situation as in the United States, where the EV adoption was sort of the second vehicle, the kind of limited adoption at a stage 2 where EVs also were performing less than they do today. The EVs that are on the market today, they have a range 300, 400, even more kilometers. And let me remind everyone here, the average Canadian drives about 12,000 kilometers a year. That's about 35, 36 kilometers a day. So you convert that into electricity, that's about 8, 9, 10 kilowatt hours a day. You can charge it quite easily at home. Even with a level 1 charger, you can charge that. You plug it in with a household socket and you can charge your EV. So you don't need a super fast charger to charge your EV in most instances if you have reliable power at home for doing it. And if you have a regular level 2 charger, no problem. You have your car charged in no time, 2 hours, 3 hours max. So today, we're living in a different world than even in 9 years, 10 years ago. Batteries are getting better. Batteries are getting cheaper, a lot cheaper. And that is changing the equation. Batteries are getting cheaper. Full stop. That is what's changing the equation.
I'd like to talk about the Chinese-made electric vehicles because this is fairly recent news. Canada has lifted the former 100% surtax and within the sort of new country-specific import quota. It's not completely gone. There's still something, right? There are to bring in there is still tariffs.
There's still tariffs, correct.
But it's an interesting thing to know whether or not this is going to bringing an influx of Chinese vehicles, and Canadians are going to be happy to have cheaper EV vehicles. But it still asks the question what effect it may have on Canadian manufacturing, given the news that we've known in the last couple of years, especially people like Doug Ford in Ontario. And I don't talk politics on my radio show, but I just did. But it is very important because this is new, but I'm curious to ask you what you think about this and what do you see the implications and possibly whether or not it's going to be a real game changer or not.
Yeah, let me first put on my hat as a trade economist because I was pulling my hairs out when we imposed a 100% tariff on these Chinese EVs. That is not what economics tells us what we should do. There is a case to be made that some of the EV industry in China is getting subsidized in unfair ways, mostly by getting access to cheap money. China has this huge savings rate that makes money cheap. Interest rates are kind of low. So everybody is into producing capacity. There's overcapacity in China. We know that. Everybody knows that who looks at China. So, and there are lots of EV manufacturers now in China. Many of them will fail. Because everybody is trying to get into the game, and we know only a few will survive in the end. But there are some biggies, namely BYD, or Build Your Own Dream, Build Your Dream. There is Chery, and there are others. There's Geely, which is a private manufacturer, and there are many others. Some are making significant inroads in markets outside North America. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Mexico, they are making inroads because they are offering what people want. That is what people need. In Europe, they have opened the door more widely. They have used the right trade instrument, which is a countervailing duty on what is considered an unfair subsidy. So there's correction for different manufacturers at the level that we think now they are unfairly subsidized. And that is the right way to go about it. Look at each manufacturer, look at the level of what is unfair here, and then you figure out what that is, and you try to create a level playing field. But once you have a level playing field, it's not 100% of a tariff. It's much more like what the Europeans put into place, 6 to 20%, depending on the manufacturer. So it's not shutting them out of the market. Now, what we have now in Canada is an MFN, a most favored nation tariff of 6.1% on these vehicles coming in from China, up to what is a tariff rate quota that is set right now at 49,000 vehicles. So this is what is allowed to come in. And I ask, what's 49,000? It's about a fifth of the EV market that we had before the subsidies were capped. So before the 2025 change in policy. And so that's not nothing, but it's not the entire market, and it's certainly not going to completely lead to an upheaval in our automobile market. So the people who have sounded the alarms They're making a lot of noise about it, but they're completely off base. This is a small amount, and that means the vehicles that are coming in are actually at the luxury end. Before we had the 100% tariff, the EVs that were manufactured in China that were coming in were Teslas, there were Polestars, and to some extent, like Volvos, for example, like plug-in hybrids that were manufactured in China with batteries from China. But they were all luxury vehicles. And they were not at the lower end. So the new policy will see this tariff rate quota expand to 70,000 vehicles by 2030. And then by that time, half of that quota is reserved for vehicles at a price point below $35,000. And if you look around, which vehicles in Canada are today sold at below $35,000? Very, 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 very few.
Yeah.
And that means this is a very, very interesting segment of the market where we're trying to push it into the market to make vehicles affordable for the people who need affordable vehicles, the people who rely on commuting but have a low income. And so I'm all for this policy. It's actually a very smart policy to make autos more affordable because the North American manufacturers have given up on that market. They want to make their money on pickup trucks and luxury vehicles. They have given up on small sedans and compact cars. And the only manufacturers that are active in the space are the foreign manufacturers, the Kias and the Hyundais of this world, the Toyotas and the Hondas of the world, the Volkswagens, and now some other European manufacturers and their counterparts, Seat and others. But this market segment had been abandoned by our North American manufacturers, and it's been claimed by manufacturers that are coming from somewhere else. And if China gets in on the game, well, originally they had terrible cars. The cars that were manufactured 20 years ago in China were terrible. Now, then they allowed European and American manufacturers to come in and into joint ventures. Chinese manufacturers learned how to build cars, good cars. The cars that are coming out of China today are competitive. They're good cars. They maybe not have reached the quality level as the top of the class from European or North American manufacturers, but they are really competitive now in market segments at the lower end, certainly. And in some cases, they can also build luxury cars. Geely is building Polestars, and they're by all means very good cars. So you see Chinese manufacturers catching up quickly. Remember China, not just China, remember Korea and remember Japan. Japanese cars, when I was a kid, were kind of laughed about. The Nissan of that day were not very great. And then the Keiretsu system in Japan figured out how to make good, reliable cars. And Honda and Toyota, they pushed a lot of cars. The Honda Civic, the Honda, all these vehicles that came into the market, and they were successful because they delivered what consumers needed. And then the Koreans came in the game. Hyundai and Kia are now. When you look at the EVs coming to the market today, Korea is dominating now the market. Kia and Hyundai, they are the ones to beat because they have figured out what people want. Go to the car shows. Look at the cars in the EV space. Yeah, you see the Teslas, or you don't see them now. They don't go to car shows in many cases. And they don't want to be seen at car shows anymore. Figure out why. But it's Hyundai and the Kia that are good, reliable cars, and you talk to the people who drive them, they're happy with them. So that is what's changing the game. And now the Chinese manufacturers come in, Geely and Chery and BYD and many others. And I probably forgot a few manufacturers here, and Leap Motor and others. They expand. They're reasonable cars. People will buy them the moment they arrive. The problem they have right now coming to the North American market is they don't have a manufacturing base here, so they are exported. They don't have a dealership network, so that part needs time to build. That took Honda and Toyota time to build. They didn't start with that. They had many years and decades to build that infrastructure. So I fully expect Chinese manufacturers to slowly and steadily come to the market, first in Canada, eventually also in the United States, because people will say, hey, you buy so many things that are made in China, why not cars? Like, look at everything you buy and see how much is made in China, and then ask yourself, is that quality stuff? A lot of it is. Yeah, you can also buy poor quality stuff made in China, but a lot of stuff is high quality. Yeah. Many of our high-end electronic items manufactured, assembled in China.
Just to name a few, yes.
Yeah, so, and there's a lot of political bias in some countries about manufactured here or manufactured there. But that is politics. The economics always looks different. And in the end, the market will always prevail. And, the politics will not. Because at the end, people will always buy what's better and what's cheaper.
This is so interesting, Werner. I really like this because this is very topical. I like this interview today because it's in our minds all the time, and we still in this country don't have the kind of transportation systems that exist in places like Japan or Germany or, even Italy, where you've got a lot of rail and more options for public transportation. I know we're building finally something to UBC.
I want my subway to UBC.
Occupied Broadway for a while now. A Canada line or extension. And that's really important. And so that's beyond, of course, this discussion. But it seems to me Canada is trying to accomplish many things simultaneously, and you definitely understand this well. So it's electric vehicles being more affordable, reducing transportation emissions, protecting, Canadian automotive employment, attract, battery and vehicle investment, which is important because we have those critical minerals, right? That was a catchy word, which really means, mining and, and getting things that we have in this country that you can't find maybe in other places, and improving consumer choice. And of course, on your specialty, diversifying this international trade. So there are these big objectives. They're not easy to figure out. And you are trying to solve, or as we talked earlier, you're asking more questions and giving answers, which is really what your research is.
I think that's the ultimate outcome for any research, that if you're doing good research, you always end up with more questions than you have answered. And whether it's for the particular research topic, but also for sort of the wider question, where does my research really fit? I have been talking a lot about EV adoption, but there's only one part of the puzzle here, because we're looking at transportation overall. And transportation emissions come from many sources. And especially when it comes to transportation, it's the vehicles we drive, but it's also for the vehicles that remain that are driving with fuel. How do we make our fuel cleaner? Can we, for example, develop biofuels that are cleaner? And the answer is yes, we can. And we have a lot of that here in Canada we can develop. It's also true for aviation fuel. That's true for other sources, for marine fuel. Now, we have to look at public transport. I'm a big fan of public transport. And because I'm from Europe. Yes. Okay, and I grew up with public transport everywhere.
Yes.
I grew up with bicycle lanes everywhere. Yeah. And so it took a long time to get those here into Canada, here into Vancouver, for example, that we have bicycle lanes now. That makes bicycling an attractive option for many. But we also need to develop that infrastructure. And we have lost that infrastructure. In North America, overall, went through this transition where we abandoned a lot of the infrastructure that existed. The trams that we had at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, are gone. Yeah. Sometimes you still see tracks here and there. There's a rail corridor that's being paved over, or that's is an existing median somewhere that used to be a rail corridor for a tram. And we lost that infrastructure, and now it's very, very hard to rebuild it. And now we're kind of regaining it little by little, but especially for the long-distance commuting for the suburban areas, we don't have a good option. We now get the SkyTrain out to Langley. That's going to be a big boost. But there's only, like a drop of water on a hot plate that evaporates very quickly. It's not enough. And we need that subway out to UBC. Please build it. Please find the money. If any politician is listening, please. We want that subway tomorrow. And
I would like it actually, too, because I commute a long way to come to this studio. Indeed. And it takes me a long time from downtown Vancouver. I think if I get a bike, I might actually get here faster sometimes. Think about that. Anyway, finally, one very quick answer. You mentioned Norway. I mean, which countries or regions currently offer what you think is sort of the best example for Canada in this world where entering and EV adoption, clean technologies, better public transportation.
Yes. It actually is not Norway. Norway has raced ahead because A, they had a lot of money they could spend. It's a rich country. B, it's a country that doesn't have an auto industry. Here in Canada, we are excessively worried about our auto industry in Ontario. Notice all the issues now we have is the United States that's disrupting it and could well kill the industry altogether because of the policies that are coming out of the United States right now that are disrupting the integrated supply chain that has actually provided the efficiencies and actually made it somewhat competitive. If you destroy that, we're losing out. If you're not investing because of the policies in the United States too, that we're kind of losing the innovation that's happening in China. Now we're killing off the industry. And so the one country we should also not look to is the United States. Where should we look to? Korea and Europe and Japan. These are the countries to look out for because Europe overall, because they're going through interesting similar issues. Germany is a good example here because they have a very strong auto industry. They have Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes. They worry about all the same things as we are here, and they're pretty much the same level. They face the very same issues. So I always like to compare Canada with Germany because of the really close comparison.
Well, we could go on and on, but we've reached our end of our talk. But it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you about all these issues.
Yeah, so I've been speaking with, if you've just joined us here at the end here, Dr. Werner Antweiler, Associate Professor at UBC's Sauder School of Business, Chair in International Trade Policy, and Chair, and also talking about his a paper that he has just gone to the printing press, if we want to use an old term. And so thank you for joining me today. And if you would like to hear this conversation, it will be this episode will be available through a podcast through CITR on CITR.ca, and now as well as on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and a full transcript, if that's okay with you, Werner, of today's interview, along with links to your research and the policies discussed in our conversation, will be available on my blog at thehourisblue.com. You have a blog too, I saw.
do. I write about a lot of things.
I like that. Go bloggers, go. So, yeah, it's nice to say that because it seems archaic, but I think it's coming back. So I am Farah Guerrero. Thank you for listening to the Blue Hour on CITR 101.9 FM in Vancouver and streaming worldwide at CITR.ca. Until next time, take good care.